Well, I mean, a podcast is an incredibly inefficient information transfer medium, right? I mean, the information that I get out of a podcast, I could probably skim in 20 seconds if I had a transcript of it in front of me. It's got to do more than that.
Welcome to the Agents of Change, the podcast experience you've been waiting for your entire marketing career. Search, social, mobile, AI, blockchain, and neuromarketing. These are the Agents of Change, and so are you. Digital marketing success awaits, and your transformation begins now.
Welcome to another episode of the Agents of Change podcast, the podcast that's here to help you reach and engage more of your ideal customers online. My name's Rich Brooks. I'm your host. This is episode 569, powered by Flight New Media. This week's episode hurts. I mean, it really hurts. Wait, before I get to that, I want to mention that I've got a podcasting survey up on our website that I'd love you to fill out. It's only 5 questions long, not including your name and email, and one lucky listener will get a $100 gift card for your favorite restaurant or store, assuming that they sell gift cards online. Bonus points if it's a local company. If they don't, we can make it an Amazon gift card. Totally your choice. Just head on over to theagentsofchange.com/survey by the end of February 2025 to be entered. Again, that's theagentsofchange.com/survey, and you just need to fill out that form before the end of February 2025, and you'll be entered. Now, if you'd rather not fill out the survey and instead chat with me about the same questions, the same topics, by Zoom for 15 minutes, I'm down for that too. Just visit that same page and there'll be a link to my calendar. Okay, back to this week's intro. This week's episode hurts. I mean, it really hurts. Podcasting is my favorite form of content creation these days. I love interviewing marketing experts on their favorite platforms, their time-tested approaches, and how they generate leads and sales for themselves and their clients. It's just my jam, right? Beyond just being able to share their expertise with you, I get to benefit from it as well. I get to ask questions that I have about my own business and how we can help more of our clients. It allows me to stay connected to some of the amazing people who I meet at events. I mean, just last week we were talking to Brian Piper, who I met at Macon last year, and it gave me the opportunity to strengthen that relationship while I was also learning about creating custom GPTs. And then recently I got to talk to Joe Polizzi, who I only ever see at conferences, and I just haven't been to as many conferences since COVID as I used to be, if I'm being honest. It's also helped me generate leads for my company, Flight New Media, as I've introduced us, or the podcast has introduced us to people across the country who likely never would have heard of Flight New Media otherwise, but turned into the show, got to know me, and ultimately we ended up doing business together. So why did this episode hurt so much? Because our guest has recently written a book called The Audience is Listening, a little guide to building a big podcast. And I was so excited to read it. Well, we have a sizable reach. It's plateaued since COVID, if I'm being honest, and I really haven't done anything about that. I figured this book would be a great primer on how I can build an audience and reach new people. However, in reading the book and in talking to its author, I realized that I hadn't been doing the things I need to do to make sure that this podcast is as valuable to you as possible. And that's the issue. The issue is less about growing an audience and more about creating a podcast that the audience can't live without. So starting today, I'm renewing my focus to make this the best damn podcast I can, and I'd like to start by hearing from you. Whether you want to fill out that survey that I posted to the website or you want to jump on a call to tell me exactly what's on your mind, I want to hear from you. I hope that's not too big an ask, but if you're willing to talk, I'm willing to listen. And again, you can find that survey at theagentsofchange.com/survey. Whether you want to hit pause right now and take that survey or book a time with me, or if you want to listen to today's interview and then take the survey afterwards, that's fine. It's there for you, and I'll repeat the URL at the end of the interview. But for now, let's get into it. My next guest is a partner at Sounds Profitable, the leading voice of significance for the digital audio industry, devoted to growing the podcast sector through audio insights, education, and connections. As a 25-year audio research veteran, he is a trusted advisor to the biggest companies in audio and has dedicated his career to the advancement of podcasting for networks and individuals alike. He's been a co-star and a driver behind some of audio's most influential studies, including the Infinite Dial series, Share of Ear, and the podcast landscape. Additionally, he's led hundreds of audience research projects in 6 continents for some of the most listened to podcasts and syndicated radio shows in the world, from Howard Stern to All Things Considered. Perhaps more interestingly, he's done a card trick for Paula Abdul, shared a martini with Tom Jones, and sold vinyl to Christopher Walken. It makes me wonder if it was a Blue Oyster Cult album. Well, he's got a new book out called The Audience is Listening, a little guide to building a big podcast. So today we're going to be growing our podcast with Tom Webster. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Rich. Thanks for having me. It's great to commune with a fellow Mainer.
Yes. I mean, we switched places, right? I grew up in the Boston area, moved to Maine. You grew up in Maine. You moved down to the Boston area. I have to say your music scene is better than ours.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. That's a fair comment. It's been a while since I've been in the Maine music scene, but Boston's pretty cool.
Yeah. We just don't get the same bands. And if they do come, they go up to Bangor. They don't stay here in Portland. So, yeah.
That was my first concert was in Bangor, Maine. This is true. It was Hall & Oates at the Bangor Auditorium.
My girlfriend's going to die. We actually went to a Hall & Oates show because she loves hair bands and Hall & Oates. And I took her to see Hall & Oates for the first time ever. They played one song and the concert was stopped for an electrical storm. They never played another note. And now, of course, it seems like they probably won't play again together. So, unfortunately,
doesn't look like it. Yeah, it does not look like it. Yeah, I did not love that whole like Hall & Oates business partner thing. It seemed like a blight on my childhood. I didn't want to know that information.
Exactly. All right. Well, before we get going on the topic, as far as I can remember, you've been involved in podcasting. And from your own book, I realize that your connection to audio has been going on for a lot longer than I've been aware of you. What was it that draws you to audio?
I was an only child. I still am, I guess. And I would often at night, I grew up in northern Maine. I grew up in Calais, which I'm sure, and there weren't like a lot of entertainment options when I was growing up. I think we had like 3 TV networks. 2 of them were Canadian. So I grew up watching a lot of the Beachcombers and stuff like that. And I just fell in love with spoken word audio. And on a good atmospheric night, you could get WBZ from Boston on a like weird cloud skip or whatever. And I would just fall asleep at night with literally a transistor radio under my pillow, listening to some of the programming on things like WBZ. And I've always loved spoken word audio. And it's just been such a gift to be able to have that, as my career and also to be able to give back to it.
It's so funny because I remember growing up after my bar mitzvah, getting a boombox in, always on Sunday night, listening to WBCN, which is another Boston station. I don't think my taste were as refined as yours. I was mostly listening to Dr. Demento, but still great memories of those childhoods just listening to audio.
Oh, I listened to plenty of Dr. Demento too, believe me.
Okay.
So,
good.
Yeah. No, yeah. Let's be clear about that.
Okay. Roly-poly fish heads forever. So I think the question on everybody's mind, and the one you've probably heard too often, is how do I grow my podcast? The point of your book. But I think, and you know this, that the question that people are really asking is, how do I get more listeners for my podcast? So what is the right question to ask in this situation?
The question that I would ask before you get to that is, why did my podcast stop growing? I think that's a better question, honestly, because when people come to me and they want easy answers or quick fixes to how to grow my podcast, it's stemming from a place of the listenership is plateaued or even declining, right? So I think you need to ask yourself, why did it stop growing? And that's a tough question. And it's a question that I think demands tough answers, because there are a lot of really bad podcasts out there. And if you're going to ask someone for 30 minutes or 60 minutes of their time, which is a real gift compared to just skimming a blog post or something that you wrote, I think you owe it to them to put on a show.
So what does that mean to you? Because I know a lot of people, I mean, obviously there's a wide variety of podcasts. You got things like Serial out there, and then you've got true crime podcasts. You got people who are just doing it for the love because they just love putting out content or they love the subject. And then there's people like me who are basically using the podcast for multiple purposes, but also to grow their business. How is the advice always the same when it comes to why my audience has plateaued or my listenership has plateaued or even gone down?
I think so. Ultimately, when your podcast stops growing, it's because people stopped recommending it. And, word of mouth is still the primary driver for podcasting right now. Word of mouth helped everything from Serial to S Town and a number of other really, and certainly Joe Rogan have really all been driven by word of mouth. And if people aren't talking about your podcast, if it's not recommendable, if they've stopped recommending it, that's essentially why a podcast stops growing. And so I do think that advice is pretty pertinent.
So you don't think that podcasts could succeed just by throwing money, advertising, and putting it in front of the core audience then?
No, not at all. And there've been some high profile failures, right? The podcast that Harry and Meghan did, right? That's wasn't a good show. And if it's not a good show, then ultimately you can throw money at anything, but it has to produce an entertainment above all else. And Meghan Markle did not do that with that podcast. And I wish her luck in future endeavors. But a celebrity doesn't guarantee success.
So let's talk, and I completely agree because I remember when Dennis Rodman got his own TV show. But let's talk about that idea because you say the show should be entertaining, but I'm sure a lot of podcasters but people need to hear about fill in the blank, AI or Game of Thrones or whatever, or the Squid Games. Isn't the content, I mean, obviously the content's not enough. That's your point. Why isn't the content enough to matter?
Well, I mean, a podcast is an incredibly inefficient information transfer medium, right? I mean, the information that I get out of a podcast, I could probably skim in 20 seconds if I had a transcript of it in front of me. It's got to do more than that. If you're going to command someone's attention for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, there are better ways to get the information, I think. And I think you need to make people feel like they are a part of something special.
So I know it would differ for everybody, but I guess that's the question then. Like, what makes a show entertaining? I mean, we've all heard two podcasts on the same topic and find ourselves more drawn to one. Is it just because some people are born with the entertainment gene and they're immediately more engaging than somebody who's not? Or are there specific things that happen in a typical show that we could emulate and bring into our own podcast to make them more engaging and entertaining?
Well, the first part of what you said, I think, is correct. Some people do have an incredible amount of natural talent. This is they're expressive, they're engaging, and that is what it is. But I think you can build a character. And I did a lot of work on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Elvis Duran or not. Elvis Duran is a syndicated morning show host out of New York. Pretty much any iHeart Top 40 station has Elvis Duran's morning show. And I worked on that show for a long time. And I got to see how they build characters. And there's almost a show Bible in a way that of what each character is doing on the show, right? Everybody has a role. Everybody has a job. It's pretty well defined. And if you don't at least start with that, then it's just noise. It's voices, it's noise or whatever. But as you start to build a show and you start to build characters, and yeah, I think any podcast has to build characters, whether it's a show about Game of Thrones or a show about marketing. What are the jobs of those characters on the show? Who do they represent in the audience? How much do you know about your audience to be able to make those kinds of determinations? So I do think there are some things you can do repeatedly to build character, to build that kind of connection with certain segments of your audience. And that's really what people are looking for, I think, when they're listening to a podcast, especially listening to it as opposed to watching it. I know video podcasts are, very top of mind and top of the news right now. But I think ultimately engaging people between the years, it requires some thought. It requires some thinking about what is the job of everybody on this show.
So in a situation like that, you're talking about a show, it sounds like, that has multiple characters, or like Howard Stern, who has multiple, basically a cast of characters. How about for people who are running a job solo? Like, are there ways that we can develop our own character to make it more engaging, kind of our own stage presence?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the key, I think, is that every show has to stand by itself, right? And if you're lucky to have an audience that listens to your show after show after show, and they kind of get to know you, that's great. They're sort of in on the inside joke, but you can't sustain that. You can't grow that over time. Like, every show has to mean something. Every show, I think, has to contribute to the plot. It has to contribute something to the arc of what it is that you're trying to do. And I think, you have to know what it is you're trying to do, right? And yeah, there are business goals for a podcast, but what are you trying to say? What is your viewpoint? What is your perspective? And does everything that you're doing contribute to that? Or could it be cut out? And I think most podcasts could do with some cutting out.
I want to get to that because that's an interesting topic, but I want to take a step back because in your book, especially at the beginning, which, and highly recommend your book, loved it. You talk a lot about research, and I know you're really a research guy. When guests come on and they say, tell me about your audience, I always feel a little bit flabbergasted because in my mind, I see this microphone, I see the screen, that's all I see. Unless somebody reaches out to me on LinkedIn or in real life, I don't really know my audience. And from reading your book, I realized what a shortcoming that is and how much better I have to do. But for those people who haven't yet picked up your book, what are some early steps we can do to get a better understanding of who our audience is and what they're looking for in a show?
Well, I think the first thing is that you can't make a show that is for everyone. If you make a show that's for everyone, it's for no one, right? It's like a football team that has three quarterbacks. They don't have a quarterback. I think the best thing you can do, even without research, is to have it an ideal person in your mind that would be the listener to your show, and try to put some clothes on that skeleton, right? Give them a name, give them a job, give them hobbies, give them wants, needs, and desires, and do the show for that single human. And like that perspective alone will produce a much better show than if you just open up the mic and believe that you're talking to everybody. Make a show for one person, a single person. Maybe it's a person that you know, and I guarantee you will do a better show, even without any research, if you just have that ideal audience, that ideal human in your mind.
I remember that John Lee Dumas was always, when he first started, had Jimmy, I think his name was, and every question that was ever asked him, he would run it through the what would Jimmy do or what would Jimmy want in a podcast. Once we've kind of moved past just speaking to one person, I know that you have some thoughts on and now I'm blanking on the other word, when you talk to people individually,
Yeah,
interviews.
qualitative.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. So talk to us a little bit about that, because obviously I'd be more interested in having some conversation with some of our listeners. How can a podcaster who's never really done that step before take those actions? What would you recommend how we get started?
Well, I think it has to start with qualitative, right? Surveys are great. I made my living doing surveys, believe me. But it starts with conversations, and it starts with asking better questions of the humans that listen to your show. One thing I can tell you, and you can see this anytime you read like Yelp reviews, people are very inarticulate about positive things. When people write a review of something, they can be very precise and specific about details of things that they don't like. But when it comes to something like a show, what you'll often get is, oh, I like it. It's fun. It's funny. I like it. Makes me laugh. Like, you can't do much with that, right? That's not like
Right.
incredibly insightful stuff. So you need to ask better questions. And, I detail some of them in the book, certainly, but there's no more powerful thing to know than why someone chooses to listen to your show. Like, what is the job that show is doing in their lives, right? When they could get that information from somewhere else, what would they miss if it went away? To me, that's one of the best questions you can ask, is if my podcast, if my show went away, went out of business, went off the air, whatever, what would you miss the most about it? And, the answer might be nothing, and that's not great, but that's an answer. But it also could be something that is the handle that people are grabbing onto. And that gives you something that you can work with, something that you can develop.
So if we're just getting started, like I know a few of the people who listen to this podcast, they've reached out to me. We've even had conversations. Some of them become clients. But if you really haven't done this, do you just ask people in your podcast, like in the podcast, hey, if you'd like to provide some feedback, do you incentivize these people to give you feedback, or how does that usually work?
Yeah, I mean, I am a big believer in incentivizing people, and if you're a podcaster with a limited budget, that doesn't necessarily have to mean cash. That can mean access to content. That can mean access to a gated community, or I think what's important though is that you close the loop on that feedback, and that in the show itself, you thank the people that provided that feedback. Maybe not by name, there are a lot, but you illustrate to your audience how you are talking to them and how their feedback is helping to make the show better, right? And that can happen in social media, that can happen by email. I'm a huge believer. There's this thing, Rich, called the offline world that you and I probably don't spend enough time in. I'm a big believer in it. And, finding where the humans are gathered in real life to talk to, I think is an underused skill by podcasters.
All right. I will check out this IRL that you speak of so highly sometime soon. I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier, which was editing. And for many podcasters, I should say, their biggest editing is maybe dropping it into Descript and getting rid of the ums and ahs. And then at the other side of the spectrum, we've got things like that are coming out of NPR that obviously have sounds, and there's obviously a team of editors working on these things that might be outside the scope of the typical podcaster. For somebody who's running their own business or marketing for a small to medium-sized business, what type of edits do you think that they could do given all the other responsibilities that they might have in their business career?
Yeah, I think there's three levels of editing. Level one is you don't do any, and you cloak that in the language of authenticity and being raw and all that. But honestly, that's not how you grow an audience. When you look at the things that are incredibly popular, that have big audiences, they have very high production values. So don't get fooled about that. There's a reason why there's, I don't know how many seasons of the Bachelor and Survivor and all. Those are very well produced shows. They're very high production quality. And if you are not going to put that level of detail into it, then you can't expect that to grow an audience. Like let's just be real about that. But I do think that there is a couple of levels of editing, right? And I'm not a fan of not doing any. The next level, I think, which you talked about, is where you are cutting out ums and ahs and obvious mistakes and things like that. I feel like that's respect for the audience in a lot of ways. But there's another level. And I think you can only access that if you get a complete transcript of a show. Take a podcast that you have done, get it completely transcribed by a human, read it over, and ask yourself, would it have been better if this part had come before this other part? Right? Some insight may have been unearthed later in the interview that it actually would be better to uncover earlier in the interview. Well, you have the ability to do that, right? And that's editing for narrative flow. That's editing for the benefit of the story, for the arc. And that's ultimately when you listen to a great podcast or, someone who's a great interviewer, like Alex Bloomberg. He's a fantastic interviewer, right? One of the absolute best interviewers in the business. And the reason why he is so good is because he is a complete avatar for his audience. He's not afraid to ask dumb questions. In fact, he asks questions that I know he knows the answer to, right? But he is a complete avatar for his audience. He asks the questions that his audience would ask. He's not afraid to appear unknowing about a topic that he's absolutely incredibly knowledgeable about in the service of that narrative arc. And understanding, is my audience going to know this term, right? If I'm doing a podcast, he does financial podcasts. If he's doing something on cap and trade, does everybody know what cap and trade is? I don't know what cap and trade is, but he's not afraid to say, I don't know what that is. Can you tell me what that is? Right. So I think that's a huge part of it. Right. And taking the time to really transcribe a show and pick it apart and ask yourself if it could have been better. It absolutely could have been better. So what are the things that you can do to make it so?
Okay. A lot of what you've talked about today has almost been, I might say, under the category of crafting. We've talked about kind of crafting an avatar and everybody having their role. We've talked about editing. You already kind of teased a little bit about this, that some people would say, well, that is inauthentic. Like that's not the way I want to go because I want to be real. What is your argument to those people who are saying, like, creating an avatar, well, that's not me. Editing the program, well, that wasn't the conversation we had. I'm sure there's a counter argument. What would you say it is?
I don't have an argument for those people. Make your art. Make your art, but don't expect an audience. People come to me when they want an audience, and you don't have a right to an audience. You don't deserve an audience. There is work to be done to get an audience. And if you feel like being unedited and raw is your art, then make your art. I'm not ever going to stand in the way of something like that. But I would ask you, what is the impact that you want to have? And would that impact be better served by being more thoughtful? And, you and I are both public speakers that, we have both done our time on stages and things like that, right? I don't swear when I'm on stage. I swear like a sailor when I'm not. And you might say that's not authentic, but what I recognize is, what is the impact that I want to have? And does that authenticity serve me in that moment? No, it doesn't serve me. What serves me is putting out the best, most thoughtful product that I can. And that is being authentic to me.
You've mentioned a few podcasters and shows today that you really like. Alex Bloomberg is one. Who are some of the podcasters that you're listening to today that you think we should be emulating? Not in terms of we should do a show just like theirs, but we could learn by listening to their podcast, whether they're in the business space or not.
Yeah. So I'm a huge fan of Ryan Russillo. And Ryan Russillo is part of the Ringer Network with Bill Simmons, and it's ostensibly sports-related content. But he has built a character for himself. He's built a character out of the couple of the producers on the show, who I think really represent the audience in ways that he doesn't. And he's elevated them to have roles on that show to kind of almost as avatars for that audience. And he does this segment at the end of every show, and it's a sports podcast, but he does this thing at the end of every show called Life Advice. And people write in, and you can tell that these people have, like, they needed an older brother, or they needed a wise uncle. And they see Ryan as that older brother or wise uncle who has been through some of the things that they're going through. And the two producers on the show, Kyle and Steve, are closer in age, I think, to a lot of the audience of the show. And so he brings them on and gets their perspective as well. It's got nothing to do with sports. It's just about how sometimes it's not easy to be a man. And it's a lot of male-centered advice for people that, maybe did not get this from their father, did not get this from an older brother or whatever. And it's meaningful. And I could listen to any number of sports podcasts, but I listened to his, and I listened to it for that.
I'm curious if you know how that originated. Was that part of the original plan of the show, or is that something that just happened organically and people just resonated with it?
It happened organically. And I think it came from doing some live events, honestly, like originally, but it resonated so meaningfully with people that they just have made it a central part of the show. And I think when you have something like that in your show, that is a tremendous gift. Like when you have a way to touch people outside of just the topic area. There are probably better sports podcasts. There are probably better podcasts to give you sports information, but you feel like you're represented when you listen to that show. If you're a part of the audience that he's trying to appeal to, there's an emotional appeal to that, which goes beyond the topic, the category. And to me, that's what makes a great show.
Some of the things that you've talked about today definitely feel like they're more about the audience being seen, about kind of building that community. Do you have any other advice about some of the things that we can do to make sure that our audience feels like they're part of the podcast rather than just consuming the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of putting their voices on the show as much as you can, right? There's a reason why talk radio was so successful. Not everybody would call in, but you had to feel like you could. You had to feel like you had that opportunity available to you. And, maybe somebody came on and said it better than you did. But I think having the voices of your listeners, it's almost like the social proof of a podcast in some ways. Yeah, I don't think we do that enough.
Great advice. If you had one actionable item that a listener today who has a podcast that maybe is stagnated or even started to lose ground, that they could start to work on this week, what would that piece of advice be?
I would get it completely transcribed. I would take the show that you thought was great, and I would get it completely human transcribed, every every and have a go at it. And I just don't think podcasters are introspective enough to do that.
Great advice. Tom, this is fantastic. If people want to pick up your book, if they want to learn more about you, where can we send them?
So the website for the book is audienceislisteningbook.com. And our company, Sounds Profitable, which really is a trade organization for the podcast industry, is at soundsprofitable.com. And you can find, I write a newsletter there every week. And we also have a daily newsletter called The Download, which is news pertaining to the industry, really, that we put out. But those are really the best places to reach out to me.
Awesome. And Tom, everybody will have all of Tom's links in the show notes. Tom, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich.
Tom really is amazing and such a great resource, even though it was a little bit of a hard pill to swallow, that the issue is not about necessarily growing your audience and more about creating the right kind of podcast for your audience. And so again, would love to have your feedback. If you have a few minutes, if you could head on over to theagentsofchange.com/survey. You can either fill out the survey right there or book a time with me. And as long as it's done by the end of February 2025, you'll be entered to win that $100 gift certificate. I really would appreciate if you can find the time to do that for me. Thank you very much. Now, if you want a transcript of today's interview, because maybe you're looking to grow your own podcast, get a bigger audience, have more reach, have more impact on the world, you can find a full transcript, the show notes, a blog post on the topic, and everything else at our website at theagentsofchange.com/569. Thank you so much for being an audience member, and I am committed to finding some time to talk with you so that I can make sure that I'm creating the show that's really going to help you grow your business.
Don't miss another thrilling episode of the Agents of Change podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform.